Now, I'm honored and overjoyed to be with you all again so soon. I was just here a month ago, for those of you who were here, and wonderful this time also to be able to share it with my dear friend and colleague, Reverend Sasha. So let me first also congratulate you on your incoming minister. Well done. I am ever so excited for what's to come. So I'm kind of like a mercenary preacher. Like I'm a community minister, so I go around and preach in a lot of different places. I don't preach in the same place very often. So, and because my ministry is devoted to social justice, I always basically preach about social justice, the topic at hand. So this is an opportunity that was very exciting because I can get a chance to preach a social justice sermon, but then also think about the pastoral concerns of how we take care of one another. So this is one of those sermons. Actually, it's totally a social justice sermon too. So just what I found very early, there's this kind of adage that in ministry you would comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But I learned that's a dichotomy that doesn't really make any sense. It's both and all the time. You can't do justice work without talking about how we take care of one another. So it's really interwoven into the same thing. So, okay, self-care is nonsense. So I was taught in divinity school to come up with like a provocative title for a sermon, but to get interest in all that, and I try to do that here. But I am actually going to make the contention that this concept of self-care is truly just that, nonsense. And maybe some of you are saying, but wait, hold on, self-care is great, it's essential. We have to take care of ourselves, right? Now, of course, I agree, we have to take care of ourselves, but it's really the how and the why we take care of ourselves and how this concept of self-care shows up. So I'm going to talk about 3 points of contention that I have with this notion of self-care, the kind of reigning cultural notion of self-care. And I'll ask you to reflect on how we might shift in our thinking and our doing. Cool? You up for it? Okay, so the first contention that I have is simply this. The concept of self-care as it's discussed in our culture is simply classist and consumerist. So the way we talk about self-care, like of treating yourself to a spa day or going out for a nice meal or getting a massage or going shopping and the like, means that taking care of oneself means that it's only accessible to those who have the means with which to engage in those activities, those with the time and the money. So to be clear, like spa days and nice meals and massages are kind of awesome, but don't get me wrong. But we recognize that defining self-care in this way means that many people just can't, right? Those of us working in mostly blue-collar and service jobs, as I have most of my life, don't have the luxury of self-care when it's defined in that way. I will say that everyone deserves to have access to nice things, and really our work for justice in the areas like workplace democracy and livable wages extends here too. But we also run into moral trouble when taking care of ourselves means consuming things, especially in a world where capitalist consumption has driven our planet and our ecology to the brink of collapse. So yes, we get to have and do nice things. I'm not arguing against that. But this is a dangerous way to define self-care. You may have seen in the media that numerous industries are collapsing and that the blame lies with the darn millennials, the millennial generation. That we millennials, and I'm like right on the edge of X and millennial, so that we aren't buying things at high enough rates and we're causing these industries to tumble. But I'd have to posit there that it's not our fault. It's kind of preposterous to blame us there. The problem is that the reality is that my generation is the first one in U.S. history that can't expect to do as well as our parents. That our lower income and dizzying rates of student debt leave many of us shackled in a state of subsistence. And self-care as expensive consumption is in fact not really self-care. So that's my first contention. We still with me? Still here? Okay, good. So I'm not asking you to agree with anything that I say, of course, just that we begin a dialogue about this. That's how I view most of preaching. So My second contention is that much of the purpose of self-care in our society and culture is actually, or the effect that it has, is actually to inure us to the realities of injustices in our lives, to acclimate us to imbalances in the way that we're forced to live, to desensitize us to the way that things work in our society and in its structures of power. So seen in this sense, self-care could be said to be the opiate of the masses. Now, as a way to be able to deal with and to continue marching and continue the work that's tearing apart our spirits and tearing apart our planet. Now, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King at one time said that what we need in our struggles is the creatively maladjusted. This beautiful term. He said that we should rightly be maladjusted to authoritarian systems and unjust institutions, and that we are called to be creative in building new ones. So when self-care is used to help us stay resigned to the way things are, that just as a way to just be able to keep going and get through our days, we're in terrible trouble. So we've got classism, consumerism, we've got self-care as, assimilation to the way things are. And the third, and I think this is the most important contention, is this, that it's steeped in a culture of hyper-individualism. It makes self-care all about me. It's a manifestation of that culture, and one that the same hyper-individualist culture that has convinced many of us that the solution to climate disaster is to curb our individual consumption of plastic straws, rather than collectively rearrange the entire global economy, which is what actually has to happen. But there's something we can take lessons from one of our own, from the Unitarian minister and transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, Emerson, through a lot of his early years and early writings, he kind of created this idea of individualism and this view of spirituality as an individual endeavor, and that it's a product of our experience in life. And so this kind of shaped much of liberal theology, and it was in the vein of liberal theology that had begun about being about that experience. But later in life, after Emerson had experienced great losses, watching many members of his family die, and having seen much struggle, by the end of his life, his writing started to recant what he had been writing about before and saying, actually, what we need is togetherness. We need each other. It's not all about the individual. Now, last week I was preaching in Greensboro, and I was talking about liberal theology and liberation theology, and talking about the need for us as religious liberals to learn from the liberationist traditions. Now, both liberal and liberation theology draw from experience as our grounding for truth. But while liberal theology draws from the individual experience, liberation theology draws from the collective experience of oppression. And we would do well to learn both from Emerson's revelations and from the liberation theology's teachings. And I'm going to try to start that conversation a little bit today. What we have here and how this concept of self-care has been shaped is really a product of the stories that our culture has, the dominant stories of what life is like, what life is about. And so many of you can probably think, or these will echo in your mind, that our culture basically says, you're on your own, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you're all alone, and you just got to make your way on your own. And that has really shaped what we'd call the story of America. The thing is, though, that's never how human beings have actually been. Living this way in all separated in different houses and yards and the like has never been how human beings have been until maybe the last 100 years. So it's actually what we call a culture of separation that is an inhuman thing. Now, like I said, most of my work is doing social justice workshops and the like, and teaching and working with social justice groups and congregations all over the country. And one of the things we do is we look at this concept of story, saying, who are we? What are we here for? And recognizing that the story that we have inherited this dominant story of power and of separation, is the one that has got us to where we are today. And so in order to get to a different place, we have to change the story. We need to create a new story together, a new narrative about life. So much of this philosophy of individualism sprang from the European Enlightenment. And a lot of it can be seen as springing from the work of Descartes. And Descartes said, which many of you will know famously, he said, "I think, therefore I am," right? And so he's placing the center of being, who I am, just because I can think as a individual alone in my brain, that's what makes me who I am. But there's another philosophy. This is a Pan-African philosophy that many of you are probably familiar with, that's referred to as Ubuntu, which says, I am because we are. So now this shifts the sense of self outside of just me and says, we are together. I am because we are. There's the much maligned work of Darwin, saying that the body of thought known as social Darwinism says that it's a competition of each against all and the survival of the fittest. But what Darwin actually said was that cooperation is at least as much a factor in evolution as is competition. And so one of my favorite thinkers of all time, Peter Kropotkin, an anarchist from the 1800s, he extended Darwin's work, and he started doing research in the animal kingdom and then went on to human kingdoms about how adaptive cooperation plays the biggest role in evolution. And he wrote a book about it that's called Mutual Aid. And those of you who know about the covenanted communities that I've started around the country, they're called Mutual Aid. So Mutual Aid Carborough, Mutual Aid Durham, etc. Now this cultural separation, this culture of separation, and the need to get back to or change the story of that culture and promote our togetherness is a vital one. Because as we see the unfolding events in our world, in our country today, we see these acts of white terrorism, and they're seen as, they always call, when the terrorist is white, they always say it's like a lone wolf. But now it seems like there's packs of lone wolves united by white supremacy, by our culture of separation. We have epidemics of loneliness that more than 50% of people don't say that they don't have a very close friend that they can confide in. That the suicide rates and the rates of antidepressants, and there's no shame in being being on antidepressants, but the rates of those are skyrocketing and have been for some time. It's an endemic of separation, of loneliness that I think in large part stems from our highly individualistic culture. For me, in starting these covenanted communities that's been my work, really sprang from my own yearning for connection and togetherness. And I encourage you to look for some other ways that people are doing this, because this kind of work is happening all over the place. There's a report that came out that some of my friends published called How We Gather. You can go to howwegather.com and see all the ways that people are trying to practice this sense of togetherness and to bring us back together. But what do we do with all that? What do we do from here? What can we do together? Now, I think that the way that we push against this story, this culture of separation, is by, as I said, creating an alternative one, and really creating alternative institutions. So there's this dude, you probably have heard of, Buckminster Fuller. Anybody heard of that dude? Okay. So he said, you don't fight something by directly fighting against the existing reality. He said, if you want to change something, you have to create a new reality that renders the old one obsolete. And this is really cool. I think he was probably taking inspiration from his great aunt, the transcendentalist and Unitarian Margaret Fuller, who wrote the first major work of feminism, women in the 19th century. But Margaret Fuller did something amazing. So at the time, Margaret Fuller was actually the first woman to be allowed access to the Harvard University Library, right? Because it was only white and male and rich. But she was allowed access into the Harvard University Library because she was seen as the best read person in New England. And so she got access, and check out what she did. She went in, she copied the current Harvard curriculum. And then she took it and brought it and formed a group of women. And they formed something called the Salon, where women taught each other the Harvard curriculum on their own. So that practice of creating an alternative institution, when the institutions we've inherited are not actually serving us, is really our work. And I think that's what Buckminster Fuller was saying, that you don't fight, you don't change something by fighting the existing reality. You change it by creating a new institution that renders the old obsolete. We've got those here. We've got those here in our congregations as well. One of them that comes to mind is this radical, crazy, liberatory, revolutionary institution of a pastoral care team. This group of people who will visit you when you're sick, when you're going through trauma, who will come to your aid or make you food. That kind of institution doesn't really exist many other places in our society. And so I see that as radical work of justice, of care. Last time I talked a little bit about the need for building alternative food systems and for collectivizing many of our industries and our economies. And that's this same work. It's the same work of practicing interdependence, as we say in our principle, that we are part of an interdependent web of all existence. This is like, actually, what does that look like on Tuesday? Or what does this look like when you can carpool to church? Or when someone needs, as I said, some food, as we're feeding each other, like we talked about earlier. Now, getting down to it, the truth is that we do need to take care of ourselves, and so take care of yourself. But I was at this gathering of what they were called a gathering of spiritual innovators, people who were doing this work of creating alternative communities and the like. And I was sitting there and digging in my bag, and I heard this voice. Well, someone bumped into me from behind, and I heard this voice that was like really eerily familiar, and I turned around, and I was face to face with Brene Brown. If any of you are familiar with her, she has a couple wonderful TED Talks and many excellent books. I highly recommend her. But I knew the voice because in my curriculum, in my social transformation curriculum, I use her TED Talks, and so I've watched it 300 times with groups that I work with. So now I'm face to face with her. It was amazing. But anyway, she was speaking to us. She was this like surprise keynote speaker that they didn't tell us about to this gathering of spiritual innovators, and she asked this question as she was in her presentation. She said, okay, they'd gone and interviewed some of the people who were seen as the deepest and most well-respected spiritual leaders in the world. And they interviewed them and were trying to find their kind of common traits. Now, what do you think they might have been? Compassion. Curiosity, well, that's a good one. Yeah, kindness. We thought so. We threw all these similar answers out, and we were all totally wrong. She said, you know what? The common thing in all of these deep spiritual leaders was boundaries. She said that the people that are seen as most compassionate are those that are able to create very clear boundaries around their time, their relationships, and how they want to move through the world. And that doing that, creating those boundaries, allows them to then bring their compassion in the ways that stun and amaze the world. So take care of yourself, yes, but changing our concept of self-care away from classism, away from ways that resign us to injustice, and away from ways that see it as just an individual thing. So what we really need to get to is a definition of self-care where that means taking care of one another, because each and every one of us deserve it. Living any other way is no way to live. We might be able to survive on our own, at least for some extent and for some certain time, but we can never thrive. We only thrive with each other. So let us thrive. Now join me in singing our closing hymn, From the Crush of Wealth and Power.